Three experienced hikers entered one of America's most remote wilderness areas, expecting a peaceful backpacking trip. But before the first day was over, they found a cup of boiling water with no one around, a trail that shouldn't exist, and voices in the darkness that sounded exactly like their own. What happened that night would leave evidence they couldn't explain, even after they escaped. We took the North Boundary Trail into the Selway-Bitterroot wilderness on a Tuesday morning in late September. It was three of us, myself, my brother Mark, and his fiancée Sarah. The weather was classic northern Idaho autumn, clear skies, sharp air, and a canopy of larch trees turning brilliant gold against the dark green ponderosa pines. Everything about the morning promised a textbook 3-day backpacking trip into deep timber. The first shift happened about 4 miles past the trailhead. We stopped to catch our breath near a granite outcrop overlooking the Selway River Canyon. The air was dead still. Mark sat on a fallen log, taking a sip from his water bladder, while Sarah checked the topographic map on her phone. That was when I noticed the camp stove. It was a MSR pocket rocket, sitting perfectly level on a flat stone right at the edge of the trail. Beside it was a stainless steel mug. Steam was still rising from the water inside the mug. There were no footprints in the damp pine needles around the rock, no pack leaning against a tree, no rustle of nylon in the brush. Just a cup of boiling water sitting 50 miles from the nearest town, fresh enough that the surface was still swirling. I looked down the trail, then up into the thick timber above us. "Hey." I called out into the trees, my voice sounding flat and swallowed by the sheer volume of space. Nobody answered. Mark looked at the steam, frowned, and muttered that maybe a day hiker had stepped into the bushes to relieve themselves. But we stood there for 10 minutes, listening. The forest was entirely silent. We moved on, but the air felt heavier, like the atmospheric pressure had dropped 20 millibars in a second. By 1 p.m., the silence had settled into something thick and suffocating. In the backcountry, you expect sound. Stake green, lodgin, stone of death. You expect the constant background hum of Douglas fir needles scraping together, chipmunks chattering in the underbrush, or the distant whistle of red-tailed hawks. But as we pushed past the 5-mile mark, the natural audio of the wilderness simply ceased. Our boots crunching on dry earth felt unnaturally loud, like somebody had cranked the gain on a microphone strapped to our ankles. Then came the footsteps behind us. At first I thought it was just the echo of my own boots bouncing off the granite walls lining the northern side of the path. I stopped dead in my tracks. 2 seconds later, 2 distinct boot steps crunched through the dry brush behind us and stopped. Mark turned around, adjusting his chest strap. "You hearing that?" he asked. "Just an echo," Sarah said, though her thumb was nervously picking at the phone grip of her trekking pole. We started walking again. I intentionally broke my rhythm, taking 3 quick paces, a pause, and 2 long strides. Behind us, 20 yards down the winding trail, the phantom set of boots matched my erratic pattern precisely. 3 fast crunches, a pause, 2 long scrapes. It wasn't an echo. Echoes don't imitate a cadence, they copy it with a delay. Whatever was behind us was adapting. We reached the junction for Indian Creek around 3 o'clock, but the junction sign was wrong. I've hiked the Bitterroots twice before. The U.S. Forest Service sign at that intersection is a thick slab of carved cedar mounted to a 4x4 post, but the wooden sign standing before us was brand new, unweathered, light pine with deep, dark lettering. It listed Bear Creek, 4 miles pointing west, and Old Creek Lookout, 2 miles pointing east. Old Creek? Mark pulled out our printed USGS quad map. There's no lookout on this ridge. There hasn't been a lookout in this section since the 1960s. Maybe it's a new reroute, Sarah suggested, her voice tightening. She kept glancing back down the trail we had just traveled. The golden light through the larch trees was fading, replaced by a dull, bruise-colored haze as cloud cover rolled in from the west. We decided to stick to the main path heading west toward Bear Creek, refusing to take the unlisted fork. But 200 yards past the junction, the trail simply evaporated. It didn't taper off into a game trail or get choked out by blowdown. The carved dirt track just stopped abruptly at the base of a dense, impenetrable wall of old-growth cedar. It looked as if the forest had grown 300 years of timber overnight across the path. Panic is a slow burn before it becomes a fire. We turned back toward the wooden junction sign, intending to double back to the main trailhead before nightfall. When we got back to the clearing, the new pine sign was gone. In its place stood a tree, a thick lodgepole pine with bark so ancient and weathered it looked like stone. On the bark, right at eye level, was a fresh blaze cut into the trunk with an axe. White wood sap was still leaking down the bark. "We missed the turn," Mark said, his voice rising an octave. He was sweating despite the cold air. "We took a wrong spur." "We didn't miss a turn, Mark. It was right here," I said, pointing to the crushed dirt where we had all stood 20 minutes ago. My stomach churned. The physical ground beneath our boots was identical, but the markers were morphing. We tried to backtrack down the trail we had originally hiked up, but as we walked, the forest refused to look familiar. The sweeping views of the Selway River Canyon vanished, replaced by an endless, repetitive grid of identical lodgepole pines. Every tree looked 6 inches wide and 30 feet tall, spaced perfectly 4 feet apart in every direction. The horizon was gone. Then we found the backpack. It was a Osprey Atmos 65-liter pack, bright orange, sitting right in the middle of the game trail we were following. It was covered in a light layer of pine needles. Sarah gasped and dropped her poles. "That's my pack. Don't be ridiculous." Mark snapped, but his hands were shaking. We walked up to it. It was identical to the pack strapped to Sarah's shoulders at that exact second. Same custom purple carabiner attached to the daisy chain. Same tear on the side water bottle pocket, patched with black Gorilla Tape. Mark reached down and unzipped the top brain of the abandoned bag. Inside was Sarah's lip balm, her headlamp, and a half-eaten bag of dried mangoes with her handwriting on the Ziploc label. Sarah turned around, dropped her own pack onto the trail, and backed away, suffocating on her own breath. How was my bag on the ground in front of us if it was on my back? Nobody answered. The wilderness doesn't give explanations. It just presents the logic and forces you to live inside it. The sun dropped behind the unseen ridge, plunging the timber into a deep, bruised purple dusk. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. We couldn't set up a camp. Nobody wanted to pitch a tent in a place where spatial reality was unspooling. We sat close together on a flat rock, our backs pressed against one another, headlamps cutting thin beams through the gathering mist. That was when the forest began to speak. It started with a voice from 50 yards down the dark hillside. It was Sarah's voice, clear as a bell. "Hey guys, I found the main trail. Come down here." Sarah, sitting right against my shoulder, stiffened. She gripped my arm so tightly her fingernails bit through my fleece layer. "That's not me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I'm right here. Mark, come on, it's just down here." The voice called out again from the darkness. The pitch, the cadence, the slight rasp in her voice. It was a flawless replica. "Don't move," I said, holding Mark's jacket as he twitched toward the sound. "We stay right here until sunrise." For 3 hours, the voice circled our rock. It used Sarah's voice, then my voice, then Mark's. It didn't just repeat words. It held full, desperate conversations with itself in the dark timber just outside the reach of our headlamp beams. It mimicked the sound of us unzipping tents, boiling water, laughing at old jokes we had shared at the trailhead that morning. It was replaying our day back to us, but twisting the context into something predatory. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped below freezing. Frost began to bloom across our boots and the fabric of our pants. The air grew so thick with mist that our headlamps reflected back into our eyes, blinding us to anything beyond a 5-foot radius. Then, the heavy boots returned. They didn't approach from the trail. They came from directly above us. We sat frozen as heavy, crunching steps walked slow circles around our rock, not on the ground, but in the thick boughs of the pine trees, 15 feet over our heads. Branch after branch groaned under immense weight. Pine needles fell onto our laps like green rain. Something massive was walking through the canopy, step by deliberate step, navigating the tree crowns as if it were flat pavement. Mark snapped. He stood up, drew his bear spray, and aimed it into the black canopy above. "Leave us the hell alone!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "Get away from us!" The footsteps in the trees stopped directly above us. A long, agonizing silence swallowed the ridge. The wind died completely. The only sound was the jagged, rapid breathing of 3 terrified people in the dark. Then, a whisper came down from the branches, inches above Mark's head. It didn't come from a voice box. It sounded like dry pine needles rustling together to form syllables. It was my voice, saying a phrase I had muttered hours earlier. "Steam is still rising." Mark dropped a bear spray. He ran. "Mark, no!" I yelled, scrambling off the rock after him. Sarah screamed, her headlamp beam sweeping wildly across a forest floor as she bolted behind me. We ran blind through the dense timber. Branches lashed across my face, cutting my cheeks, tearing at my clothes. The forest felt infinite and completely claustrophobic at the same time. There were no trails, no contours, no landmarks, just an endless, suffocating vertical grid of gray trunks, illuminated by the frantic bounce of our lights. Every direction we ran felt downhill. We ran for what felt like miles, lungs burning on the freezing air, feet slamming violently against roots and hidden rocks. But no matter how fast we sprinted, the sound of Mark's heavy breathing and frantic boots was always right beside me, even when I couldn't see him in the fog. Suddenly, the trees cleared. We burst out of the thicket, legs giving way, tumbling down a soil bank onto a wide gravel surface. I crashed hard onto my knees, my breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. Sarah collapsed next to me, weeping hysterically into the dirt. It was a road, a 2-lane paved Forest Service road. Across the asphalt sat my truck, a red Toyota Tacoma, parked precisely where I had left it at the north boundary trailhead. The morning sun was just beginning to bleed a pale gray light over the eastern ridge. We had survived. We scrambled into the cab of the truck, slamming and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so violently it took me 3 attempts to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the heater blowing cold air that slowly warmed up as I slapped the truck into drive and tore down the gravel forest road, leaving the Selway-Bitterroot behind us. We didn't speak for the entire 4-hour drive back to Missoula. The relief was overwhelming, a warm wash of adrenaline exhaustion that made my eyelids heavy and my limbs feel like lead. We had made it out. The nightmare was over. It was just an episode of extreme spatial disorientation, altitude sickness, mass hysteria, whatever logical lie we needed to tell ourselves to keep our sanity intact. 3 days later, I was sitting in my apartment, trying to resume a normal life. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Sarah. She had uploaded the photos from her digital camera to a shared drive so we could send them to the search and rescue team to report the missing signage. I opened the folder. There were 40 photos of beautiful mountain vistas, the larch trees, the clear blue sky. Then I reached the last photo on the memory card. It was a picture Sarah had taken at 11 a.m. on our first day, a candid shot of Mark and me standing near the granite outcrop, smiling before everything went wrong. The sun was shining brightly, throwing clear, crisp shadows across the light dirt of the trail. I zoomed in on the photo. In the picture, Mark was throwing a shadow to his left. I was throwing a shadow to my left. But standing directly between us, holding hands with both of our shadows, was a third shadow. It stretched out from empty air, dark and elongated, its upper torso distorted, long fingers entwined with ours on the ground. In the very bottom corner of the image, visible only if you look at the lower edge of the frame, my shadow had 4 legs and wasn't facing the camera at all. I spent 7 summers working as a seasonal fire lookout for the United States Forest Service, mostly posted in the northern reaches of the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. It's a lonely life, but it has a rhythm. You learn to read the wind, you learn the language of dry lightning, and you get comfortable with the idea that for 90 days a year, you are the highest point of human presence for 40 miles in any direction. In August of 2018, I was assigned to Watchman's Ridge, a remote wooden CAD built atop a steel frame, towering over a razor-fin granite spine. The first hint that the mountain was off dropped on a Thursday afternoon. It was 2:15 p.m., clear skies, 84 degrees, humidity hovering at 12%. I was doing a standard binocular sweep of the eastern drainage when I noticed the smoke. It was a single, thin white plume rising from the basin near Timber Creek, a textbook sleeper fire from a lightning strike 3 nights prior. I pulled out my Osborne firefinder, lined up the sighting hair, and keyed the mic on the Motorola base station. "Dispatch, this is Watchman Lookout. I have a smoke report. Bearing 114 degrees, distance approximately 6 miles, lower timberline near Timber Creek." The radio crackled instantly. "Copy, Watchman. Be advised we have no crews in that sector, but we have an observer on the ground at the Timber Creek shelter. Did you see the signal flash?" "Negative, dispatch. No flashes, just the plume." I put the mic down and raised my binoculars back to the sight line. The plume was gone. Not dissipating, not blowing out in the wind. It had simply ceased to exist between the moment I let go of the talk button and the moment I put the glass back to my eyes. But sitting right at the base of where the smoke had been, parked on an overgrown, abandoned logging spur that hadn't been usable since 1984, was my own truck. A faded blue 2002 Ford Ranger, complete with the dented tailgate and the faded USFS parking permit on the driver's side windshield. I was looking at my own vehicle through 12 power optics, 6 miles away, while the keys to that exact truck were resting on the laminate table 3 feet behind me. I stood there for a long time, staring through the lenses until my eyes watered. The truck sat perfectly still in the wash of dead timber. I turned around and checked the wooden peg where my keys hung. They were there, heavy and brassy, catching the afternoon light. When I looked back through the binoculars, the logging spur was empty again, overgrown with heavy alder brush and choked with fallen Douglas firs. That night, the mountain began to close the distance. Around 11 p.m., the wind died entirely. In a fire tower, total silence is unsettling because the glass windows usually creak under the mountain updrafts. Without wind, the CAD feels suspended in a vacuum. I was sitting at the map table writing my daily log when the first sound came up from the catwalk outside. It was the distinct, metallic clink of steel boot spikes heading the iron grate of the catwalk steps. Clink, clink, clink. I froze, pen suspended above the paper. The Watchman cab sits 80 feet above the granite outcrop, accessible only by a single set of steep, open grate wooden stairs with steel handrails. To reach the top, someone has to climb 74 steps. Clink, clink. I reached for my heavy maglite and stepped toward the eastern door. "Forest Service," I called out, trying to project authority. "Who's on the stairs?" No answer. Just the steady, unhurried rhythm of boots climbing up the iron steps. I unlatched the door and stepped onto the outer catwalk, shining the heavy beam of light straight down the stairwell. The beam cut through the crystal-clear night air, illuminating every single step, all the way down to the solid rock anchor at the bottom. The stairs were completely empty. Yet, as I stood there staring at the illuminated bare wooden treads, the sound didn't stop. It kept coming up. Clink, clink. The sound passed right through the beam of light, 6 feet away from me, moving up the last 5 steps, onto the steel catwalk, and stopped directly beside my right boot. The iron floorboard under my foot dipped down 3 inches at the sudden, heavy weight. I slammed the door, threw the heavy brass deadbolt, and pulled down the window blinds. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I sat on the floor in the center of the cab, right beneath the Osborne firefinder, and didn't move until the sky turned gray. By noon the next day, the heat had spiked to 98 degrees. I tried to call dispatch to request a temporary replacement, citing a severe migraine, the standard cover for when a lookout starts losing their nerve. But the Motorola radio was acting strangely. When I keyed the mic, there was no static. Instead, I heard the faint, distant sound of my own voice coming back through the speaker, repeating words I hadn't said yet. "Dispatch, I have heavy smoke on Watchman Ridge. The tower is compromised. I am coming down. Dispatch, do you read?" I yelled into the hand mic, my knuckles white. The speaker crackled. "The tower is compromised." My own recorded voice answered from the radio. "I am coming down." I ripped the power cable out of the back of the radio base. The speaker clicked off, but 3 seconds later, the faint, tinny sound of my voice kept spilling out of the dead plastic housing, repeating the same line over and over into the silent room. I decided to pack my gear and leave. Safety protocols be damned. Something was warping the environment around Watchman's Ridge, and I wasn't going to let it trap me 80 feet in the air. I grabbed my day pack, unbolted the door, and stepped onto the catwalk. The landscape was wrong. Watchman's Ridge overlooks 3 distinct valleys: Timber Creek to the east, Lost Horse to the north, and the Methow Basin to the south. But as I looked out over the railing, the geography had collapsed. In every single direction, north, south, east, and west, lay the exact same valley. It was the Timber Creek Basin, mirrored 4 times around the peak. The same burnt pine snag, the same dry riverbed, the same abandoned logging spur, repeated in an infinite, seamless loop to the horizon. The mountains were gone. There was no way down because every trail leading off the summit ridge now pointed toward the same burnt, endless loop of timber. Panic finally broke through my discipline. I ran down the 74 wooden steps, my boots slamming against the treads, desperate to hit solid rock. When I reached the bottom step, I didn't land on granite. I landed back on the top catwalk, right outside the door of the cab. I turned around, terrified, and sprinted down the steps again, faster this time, descending 20, 40, 60 steps, only to burst back onto the top platform, staring at the locked door of my own lookout cab. The stairs had become an impossible loop. The harder I ran down, the more firmly I was returned to the highest point. The sun began to set, but it didn't sink into the west. It simply faded out, like a bulb losing voltage, plunging the ridge into an unnatural flat darkness that lacked stars or a moon. Then the heat came. It didn't come from a forest fire, and mine showed that it would be dumb, but would rain the sun's rain. Oh no! Then the heat came. There was no smell of pine pitch burning, no ash floating in the air, no crackle of dry brush going up in flames. But the temperature inside the cab began to climb exponentially. 100 degrees, 110 degrees, 120 degrees. The glass windows began to warp and bubble in their wooden frames. The paint on the wooden walls started to blister and pop, releasing the chemical stench of scorched enamel. I stripped off my heavy canvas shirt, gasping for breath, pouring water from my canteen over my skin. Outside, the steel frame of the tower began to groan under thermal expansion, screeching like a dying animal as the metal twisted. I looked out the warped glass window. Standing on the granite outcrop 80 feet below, surrounded by the blistered, dead silence of the mountain, was a figure. It was wearing the heavy green USFS field jacket and khaki trousers of a ranger. It was looking straight up at the cab. I raised my binoculars with hands that were slick with sweat. The figure standing at the base of the tower was me. It was wearing my clothes, holding my radio, staring up at the glass, with an expression of calm, detached observation. And as I watched through the optics, the me on the ground pulled out a notebook, wrote something down, and turned to walk away down the path into the endless timber. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that tore my throat, and threw my shoulder against the locked door of the cab, crashing out onto the catwalk. The moment my feet hit the metal grate, the heat vanished. The air was suddenly freezing, cold, crisp alpine air that burned my lungs as I gasped for breath. The sky above was clear, filled with thousands of sharp stars. The four mirrored valleys were gone, replaced by the familiar contours of the Okanogan-Wenatchee wilderness. Below me, sitting at the base of the trail, was a USFS pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two Rio Rangers were standing by the bumper, shining a spotlight up at the tower. "Watchman!" one of them yelled through a bullhorn. "Are you all right up there? We lost your radio comms 12 hours ago." I collapsed against the railing, tears of relief flooding my eyes. I couldn't speak. I could only wave my arm weakly through the spotlight beam. They helped me down the stairs, the 74 steps finally leading to the ground, and drove me straight to the district office in Winthrop. I submitted my resignation that night. I didn't care about the breach of contract, the loss of pay, or the bewildered looks from the district ranger. I packed my belongings into my Ford Ranger and drove back to my home in Spokane, promising myself I would never step foot in a national forest again. It took 6 months for the nightmares to fade. By the following spring, I was working a quiet desk job in city planning. I had almost convinced myself that I had suffered a severe heat-induced psychotic break on Watchman's Ridge, a combination of dehydration, altitude, and extreme isolation. Then, in April, I received a package in the mail. It was a standard USFS manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from the regional office in Portland. Inside was my official service file, released under a routine records archiving request I had filed a year prior. I flipped through the employment logs, the payroll sheets, and the equipment sign-outs. Attached to the back of the file was the daily log sheet from Watchman's Ridge for the day I left, August 16th, 2018. It was written in my own handwriting, in neat black ink. I read the final entry, 14:15, observed smoke plume near Timber Creek. Confirmed sleeper fire. Subject in tower is currently observing through glass. Temperature inside cab rising as scheduled. Subject believes he is escaping. Will maintain observation until next cycle. The Gila Wilderness in southwestern New Mexico is the oldest designated wilderness area in the country. It's over 300,000 acres of rough volcanic terrain, deep river canyons, and ponderosa pine forests that haven't seen a road since before the state was admitted to the Union. I was working a 10-day stint for the Bureau of Land Management as a seasonal boundary surveyor. My job was simple: locate forgotten 19th century survey monuments, stone cairns, copper caps, and brass discs set into bedrock, and mark them with updated GPS coordinates. I preferred working alone. A 3-day solo loop through the Little Bear Canyon area was supposed to be routine work before the autumn frost set in. The first disturbance happened at a creek crossing about 12 miles in. I had stopped near a gravel bar where the trail crossed a shallow fork of the Gila River. The afternoon sun was high, reflecting off the red rock canyon walls. I took off my pack, sat on a flat boulder, and pulled out my field book. Beside my boot, right at the water's edge, was a brand new leather glove. It was a standard beige cowhide work glove, double-stitched, clean, and completely dry. It sat resting on a patch of silt that had been smoothed over by the morning's high tide line. What caught my eye wasn't the glove itself, but the position of it. The fingers were neatly pressed flat against the sand, pointing directly upstream toward a canyon wall that rose sheer for 300 feet. I picked it up. The leather was supple, unweathered, and smelled faintly of cedar grease. I turned it over and looked at the cuff. Written in faded black Sharpie on the inside lining was my own last name and first initial, M.V. Vance. I don't own leather work gloves. I only wear synthetic climbing gloves on survey runs. I looked around the canyon floor. The gravel bar was immaculate. No boot prints, no campfire ring, no crushed grass. Just my own single set of tracks leading from the main trail to the rock where I sat. I shoved the glove into my side pocket, assuming it was a strange coincidence or an old piece of gear I had somehow forgotten dropping years ago. though deep down I knew the leather was too fresh to have sat in the sun for more than an hour. By late afternoon, the terrain had started to deform. I was following an established section line heading due north toward a ridge known as Black Mountain. My compass needle, a liquid-damped Brenton pocket transit that had never failed me, began to drift. It didn't spin erratically like it would near iron ore deposits. It slowly, smoothly swept 45 degrees to the east, locked into place, and stayed there. I pulled out my handheld Garmin GPS unit to cross-reference. The digital screen flickered, the satellite signal icon dropped from 4 bars to 0, and the display displayed a single line of text. Distance to boundary, 0 feet. I looked down at my feet. I was standing in a carpet of dry pine needles, beneath a stand of massive ponderosa pines. There was no fence, no cut line, no blaze on the trees. But as I took a single step forward, with my left boot, the sound of the forest cut out instantly. Not gradually, instantly. The sound of the wind through the pines, the distant rush of the river, the hum of cicadas in the warm air were snapped off like a light switch. I pulled my foot back 6 inches, and the audio returned with full volume. I stepped forward again. Dead silence. I stood on the invisible seam for 5 minutes, shifting my weight back and forth across a boundary line that didn't exist on any government map. The air on the other side of the line was 5 degrees colder and smelled of ozone and wet ash. I turned around to go back to the river. The trail I had walked up 30 minutes prior was gone. In its place was a dense, ancient wall of scrub oak and fallen logs that looked like it had been rotting undisturbed for 50 years. The path hadn't just been blocked. The topography had made itself closed behind me. I pulled out my topo map and map wheel, trying to orient myself using the high peaks on the horizon. But when I looked up through the canopy, the horizon line was flat. Black Mountain, a 4,000-foot volcanic peak that had been towering over my left shoulder all afternoon, was gone. The sky met the tree line in a straight, unnatural horizontal edge, like a painted backdrop on a stage set. Dusk fell with unnerving speed. The sun didn't set beneath the horizon. The light simply drained out of the sky over a span of 10 minutes, leaving the forest in a dull, uniform shade of slate gray. I made camp in a narrow, dry wash, building a small fire against a wall of basalt. I sat with my back pressed against the cold rock, my survey staff laying across my lap like a weapon. Around midnight, the echoes started. A mile off to the west, a heavy rock shifted and slid down a gravel slope. A few seconds later, the echo returned from the eastern ridge, not as the dull, muffled bounce of sound off rock, but as a clear, distinct voice, speaking a full sentence in my own voice. A mile off to the west, a heavy rock shifted. I held my breath, feeling the hair on my arms stand up. 10 minutes passed. I picked up my canteen, unscrewed the metal cap, and took a drink. From the darkness 50 yards out in the timber, the sound echoed back to me. But it wasn't the sound of a canteen cap. It was the sound of a metal cap unscrewing, followed by my voice, loud and clear in the quiet night. I took a drink. It wasn't echoing what I said. It was echoing what I did, converting my actions into spoken narrative in real time. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling as I aimed my headlamp into the thick pine trunks. The response didn't come from the forest. It came from right behind my head, from inside the solid basalt rock wall I was leaning against. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. I scrambled to my feet, dropping the canteen, and ran down the wash. My headlamp beam bounced wildly across the dry river stones. The forest around me was moving. As I sprinted, the trees on my left were sliding backward faster than I was running, while the trees on my right remained completely motionless, creating a nauseating visual tear in my peripheral vision. I ran until my legs gave out, tripping over exposed root and crashing hard onto a shelf of flat bedrock. I lay there, chest heaving, blood tasting like copper in the back of my throat. The sky above was completely black. No stars, no moon, no clouds, just an infinite void of nothingness. When the light returned, it didn't come from the east. The gray illumination simply seeped back into the air, revealing that I had run in a complete circle. I was sitting right back on the flat rock near the Gila River where I had found the glove 24 hours earlier. My pack was resting against the boulder, exactly where I had left it. The fire pit from the previous night was nowhere to be seen. The trail leading back toward the trailhead was wide, open, and clearly marked with yellow Forest Service blazes. I didn't stop to pack my gear properly. I shoved everything into my haul bag, strapped my survey staff to the side, and hiked the 12 miles back to my truck at the trailhead parking lot without stopping once. I drove straight back to the district office in Silver City, submitted my field notes, and resigned my position with the Bureau of Land Management the next morning. I moved to Phoenix. I took a job working in residential real estate, far away from public lands, deep wilderness, and open spaces. 4 years later, I was clearing out a box of old field equipment in my garage. At the bottom of the box was the waterproof field book I had used during that final trip in the Gila. I opened it to the last page I had written on before the compass started drifting. The page was blank, except for a single entry written at the very bottom in my own neat, technical block lettering. An entry made in waterproof ink that I know for a fact I never wrote. Surveyor Vance reached the boundary line at 14:30. Subject was cataloged, processed, and allowed to exit. Duplicate unit deployed to Phoenix on September 14th. Original remains on site for maintenance.